My boss is usually great, but once a month, things get a little hairy. Part 2. Gerald turned in an instant. It wasn't like a full moon when he and Mary had struggled against the transformation, when it was as though they were trying to will each bone, each hair follicle to stay in place and failing to do so. Gerald wasn't fighting his wolf nature anymore. He was embracing it. And how? Candice was able to fire off an impotent shot from her gun before Gerald lunged at her and sank his fangs into her shoulder. He lifted her then with his jaws, off her feet, and flung her against a wall with a flick of his neck. She collided with a shelf of medical supplies, which all went clattering to the floor as she cried out in pain and shock. She slumped down, clearly injured and terrified, but still conscious. I eyed the gun with the silver bullets that Gerald had dropped to the floor when he had transformed into a wolf, but I stood frozen, too afraid to make a move, too unsure of what move to make. He had just found out that his children had been murdered, and then he had shot his own wife dead. I could understand the man's rage. But it wasn't a man that I was encountering. The beast that was Gerald let out a low growl and jumped up onto the table where Melissa was still strapped, with an open wound across her abdomen, exposing her guts. Gerald clamped down on a string of intestine in his mouth and yanked violently, tearing it apart. A foul stench spread across the room, as did a spray of blood and half-formed fecal matter. Melissa didn't stir, as she was still under the effects of the anesthetics. No matter what she had done, I was grateful for that. Her screams would have made it harder to think, and it was already hard enough to think. I saw an underarm crutch hanging on the wall and reached for it, while Gerald was distracted. I thought that I could use it to slide the gun over to me without getting closer to the dangerously furious wolf. Gerald was ripping into Melissa's neck now, pulling her esophagus out. I kept my eyes on that scene while I grasped the crutch and lifted it off the hook. It was difficult to watch. I'd seen most any medical procedure you can imagine, but those always happened under controlled conditions. Here now was a wolf tearing into a human being, tearing at the flesh, pulling away organs, flinging them away, and then going for more. Behind this scene, I saw Candice grasp onto a shelf and pull herself to her feet. As soon as she did, Gerald whipped his head around and let out a howl. Then he leapt. I reached out with the crotch and tried to drag the gun to me, and Gerald dug all 10 claws on his hands into Candice's neck. I succeeded in pulling the gun a foot or so closer to me as Gerald pulled her head off of her body. He held it up above his own head, howled again, and then dropped it with a sickening splat. Then he turned to face me, growling. I dropped the crotch and he dropped to all fours and began stalking towards me. "Gerald," I said. "It's me, William. It's over. You got your revenge. It was well deserved. Now please, come back." Gerald bounded through the air and impacted me, knocking me to the ground with his impossibly heavy weight on top of me. He bit into my shoulder and tore a chunk away. The pain was unbearable, and I screamed out, "Gerald!" He stopped, mid-lunge with his terrifying maw hanging open. He leaned his face into mine, his pink eyes inches away from my own, his hot breath stinking of meat. Then he closed his jaw and began sniffing me with his snout. "Please," I muttered. Then he turned and ran out of the room. I dressed the wound on my shoulder while I tried to think about what to do. The burning pain made it difficult to focus, but I was eventually able to gain my bearings. Salvatore Sartori. He must have put a hit on Gerald's family as payback for us not saving his son's life. That was the only thing that made sense. So now Gerald was almost certainly on his way to perpetuate the cycle of revenge. I looked down at Mary's dead body and couldn't blame Gerald. But he had given me clear instructions on what to do if he ever was unleashed to the world in his transformed state. If you can, shoot to wound. If you can't, shoot to kill. I scooped up the gun with the silver bullets and headed out the door. Sartori was usually at his restaurant just out of town. When he required our services, that's where we went, down to the basement. So I figured that was probably the first place where Gerald went, though I'll admit, I didn't know how it worked. Can werewolves remember and reason? Either way, that was the only thing I could think of to do. When I got outside, I saw that Gerald's car was still in the driveway, meaning he'd taken off on foot or paws or whatever those horrible and sharp appendages were called. He was incredibly fast, had gotten a head start, and could travel places where cars couldn't. But there was still a good chance I could get there before him if I sped. The only question was if I wanted to get there before him. Satori had ordered the death of his wife and children. He deserved to die. For that reason, I decided not to speed to the restaurant. Well, for that reason, plus the fact that it was hard to focus on the road. The pain in my shoulder seemed to be spreading out, setting my body on fire. A werewolf bit me, I thought. That can't be good. After a few minutes of driving, I arrived at Satori's Italian restaurant. There were a few cars in the parking lot, but no signs of activity, until I heard the gunshots and screams coming from inside. I decided to let Gerald finish his business. I got out of my car and sat crouched behind it, the gun clenched in my hand, aiming at the front door. I figured I had one shot and one shot only. I would aim for the thigh if I could. Gerald had given me shooting lessons and I'd gotten fairly proficient, but I knew that it would be hard to hit a target capable of moving so fast with any kind of precision. I crouched there for what seemed like a long, dreadful time as my fear mounted and the gun became slick with sweat. Then the door to the restaurant flew open and there was the monstrous wolf dripping in blood and gore. It dropped down on all fours and started sniffing the ground, giving me the perfect opportunity for a targeted shot. I tried to aim the gun, but I couldn't. My hand was shaking. I grasped it with my other hand as well, though that was weak with the pain spreading out from my shoulder. I clenched my jaw and tried to steady myself as Gerald continued sniffing the ground. Then he looked up, directly at my car. I started to squeeze the trigger, aiming in his general direction. That was the best I could do. Suddenly, I saw a flash of silver, and Gerald's wolf head came flying off its body. I released the trigger and watched in horror and confusion as the head hit the ground with a thud. The body remained standing for several seconds, convulsing before it too dropped to the ground. Then the head and body transformed back into their human forms. I stayed crouched down, trying to figure out what had happened. Two men emerged from behind a jeep. One had a gun pointing at Gerald's corpse. The other walked over and picked something off the ground. "Damn, Jameson, you've got pretty good aim with that thing," said the man with the gun. I looked to see that Jameson was holding some kind of silver brooch. Yeah, well, if I'm being honest, the thing kind of has a mind of its own. "Do you think it will work, Clarence? Against the big one this Friday?" "I sure as shit hope it does, kid," said Clarence, rolling Gerald's severed head over with his foot. Never seen this one before. These fuckers are coming out of nowhere in droves." "That's bad, right?" asked Jameson. "Well, it's good for business," said Clarence, bending down to pick up Gerald's head by the hair. He stuffed it into a duffel bag that he had around his shoulder. "But in general, if you're asking in general whether it's a good or bad thing that we've got a shitload of werewolves coming out as we get closer and closer to the full moon, if you're asking in general whether it's a good or bad thing that the big one is coming, well, Jamie, I'd have to say that it's a very bad thing. In general, now help me with the body." I watched in helpless horror and confusion as the two men dragged my friend's body over to the trunk of the Jeep. They hoisted him in. Then they got in the front and pulled out of the parking lot. I've been locked inside my house for the past 2 days now. The pain at first spread throughout my body until I couldn't move or think. Then it was gone, replaced by an incredible alertness and feeling of vigor. A thick patch of hair has begun to sprout on my shoulder, at the spot where Gerald bit me. I am, without a doubt, turning into a werewolf. The full moon is in 5 days. Thank you for listening and delving into the dark with me. I would be so grateful if you please click the thumbs up, subscribe, and leave a comment. The more engagement this video gets, the The more YouTube will push my content to others, and thus our twisted little community will grow. All stories read on this channel will be available on Spotify, iTunes, iHeartRadio, and many other podcast apps. Links are in the description. Thank you again for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you.